Welcome to Season 3 of the Canadian Powerlifting Podcast, the bi-weekly show that brings you the best of powerlifting in Canada. Our three co-hosts include Ryan Stinn, holder of the highest equipped total in Canada, as well as owner of Unparalleled Training Centre in Moose Jaw, and co-owner of Inner Strength Products, Steve Cassioli, IPF world record holder and medalist, third strongest Canadian classic powerlifter of all time, and owner of Cassioli Strength and Conditioning. Lastly, Avi Silverberg, world bench press medalist, national team coach, and co-owner of MyStrengthBook.com. Today's episode starts right now.
This season of the Canadian Powerlifting Podcast is brought to you by MyStrengthBook.com. MyStrengthBook is a web-based platform for powerlifters to build workouts, plan training programs, and assess training metrics that lead to better performance on the platform. Tracking and analyzing training metrics allow you to uncover key trends and insights on what works for you and the precise variables that lead to greater success. Say goodbye to pen and paper tracking and hard-to-use spreadsheets. Say hello to MyStrengthBook. Sign up now for a free trial at www.mystrengthbook.com.
Hello and welcome back to the Canadian Powerlifting Podcast. You're tuning in on another episode, and this week we are sitting down with Connor Lutz from Saskatoon. And if you don't know who Connor Lutz is, he's been competing since 2010. He's competed at 5 international IPF championships, 4 of those being the World Championships. He competed at the very first IPF Classic World Championships, placing second as a junior. In the last 2 years, he's placed 5th at the World Championships as an open. And very interestingly, he's actually, over the course of his career, transitioning from junior to open, where most people go up in bodyweight class, he's gone down from 83 to 74. And we talk a little bit about that. But the bulk of the episode is about programming. And we get into some very practical details around setting up a training program, Connor's experience in terms of self-programming, taking a lot of his early experiences with doing that and what he's learned and what he does now, and the sorts of how he sets up a full training cycle leading up to competition. It was a very, very in-depth, fast-paced, practical episode, and I'm really happy to be putting out this sort of content because I think it's going to be valuable for a lot of people who have been thinking about self-programming or just sort of want to understand programming in a little bit more detail. So we're not going to do an intro today because we have recorded with him for a full hour. So it's a lot of detail, a lot of action in this episode. So we're just going to cut right to it, our interview with Connor Lutz. This week on the Canadian Powerlifting Podcast, we're sitting down with Connor Lutz. Now, I'll just tell you a little bit about Connor and his background before he tells you about his history. He's been competing since 2010. He's had a lot of success as a junior athlete and a lot of success as an open athlete. So we'll talk about sort of that transition from junior to open. He's competed at 4 World Championships. He competed at the first, it wasn't really the IPF Classic World Championships. It was called the Classic Cup. That was the first sort of international competition sanctioned by the IPF that was classic only, and that was in Sweden. And then Connor competed at the very first IPF Classic World Championships in Russia. He was competing as a junior and placed second at that event. And then he's gone on to compete at 2 more Classic World Championships as an open athlete in South Africa and in Killeen, Texas, placing 5th at both of those events. And in South Africa, and we'll talk more about this, at the time you actually broke the open world record for bench press, and we're going to talk a little bit more about bench press. Also, interestingly, Connor started his career as an 83 athlete as a junior, and then as he's moved into open, he has cut from the 83s to the 74s. And in Killeen, Texas, just last year at the World Championships, he competed as a 74 kilo athlete. And impressively, Connor has a 499 raw Wilks, 1 point shy of that 500 mark. Connor, welcome to the podcast.
Point 3, I think it is. 499.3.
I'm corrected. 499.3. Don't want to shortchange him whatsoever. Welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
Good. How are you guys?
Good.
Doing well. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your history in the sport? We know that as I said, you've been competing since 2010. Tell us a little bit about how you got into it and sort of your progression to date.
Well, I actually got into the sport before 2010. I can't remember the exact year. I was playing football at the university in Saskatoon here. I did a couple meets as a 74 then. Wasn't really training for powerlifting, just kind of lifting weights, kind of doing the bro thing while I played football. And I looked up the provincial bench press records, which were equipped at the time, but I didn't realize that was a thing. So I signed up for a bench only meet, and I think there was like 8 people total at the meet. This is before powerlifting was like a real thing. So show up to this meet, and Ryan Fowler, Rhea, obviously we're at the meet and being in Saskatchewan and everything, and convinced me the day of to switch from the bench only to the 3 lift, because bench only people, aren't real powerlifters. That one's
oh man, that's
really heavy, I guess. They convinced me to do the 3 lift that day. And worked up to openers in the back room. Had no idea what I could squat or deadlift or anything like that. I was wearing some Reebok running shoes, no belt, no whatever. I actually borrowed a singlet from Chris Arnold. So he's a 93. So I had a 93, kind of like a parachute kind of singlet. That there was actually hair ties, like tying up the strap. Was so big and baggy on me. But so opened up with a squat, I can't remember, and took like a 50-kilo jump and missed it on my 3rd. And then on the bench, I missed my opener on commands or something dumb like that. And then I think I got it again on my 2nd, or got it on my 2nd. And on my 3rd, took some sort of pound to kilo jump that was like, going from 275 to 315. So it's probably like, 125 to 142 or something like that. And then I missed that. I don't know if I just flat out missed it, or if I brain farted, or I don't know what happened. But so I went 1 for 3 in the bench, but I broke the bench record. And then just the provincial junior one. But at the time, like that was a thing for me. And then in the deadlift, I opened really light because obviously I needed to secure that bench record. Like that was a thing that was going in the record book. So I couldn't miss my opening deadlift. So opened up with something really light, then took a big jump on my 2nd, and then I can't remember if it was which Ryan it was, Stan or Fowler, but they were looking and they're like, I think you could qualify for nationals. So they start crunching some numbers, and they take another huge jump to my 3rd deadlift, which was 200 kilos. So I'm wearing these squishy Reebok running shoes, this baggy singlet or whatever. And then someone lent me a belt for this 3rd deadlift, which I had never worn before. So then I ended up pulling 200 kilos, and it was just a disgusting lift, just huge grind or whatever. But so I got that, qualified for nationals, which I think was like 3 weeks away or something. The meet was the day before the nationals deadline, or 2 days before, or something like that. Everyone's obviously lifting equipped. I lifted sort of semi-equipped at this meet or whatever. Like didn't wear knee wraps because they hurt my knees, and I squatted in deadlift suit that was way too big and didn't do anything. And I missed my 2 benches at nationals that year in a shirt. Took the shirt off, got it on my 3rd. That was kind of the end of that era. I finished up playing football. I played another year, maybe even 2 years. So I don't really consider those the start of my powerlifting. I mean, I was exposed to the sport, but I was just, living the dream sort of thing. So then what I consider my start to powerlifting was the year you're talking about, when I went to the Classic Cup. And that year I did 2 meets as a 74, actually. I was in Calgary that year. I decided to make the jump to an 83, and went up to 83, did I think the 3 years or whatever it was as an 83. But I always struggled to actually be an 83, I guess. And before the sport got as popular as it was, and the sample of quality lifters grew to the size it was, I could, I guess, get away with weighing in at 80, 81 kilos. And now the guys that are competing at 83 and winning 83 are walking around to like 86, 87, 88 even, and come down to that 83 class. And I was struggling just to be like 81 on the day. I guess the push to send me back to 74 wasn't so much the competition at 83, but I had some injuries and kind of used the diet down to 74 is just an additional motivator to kind of heal up and not be, pushing the intensities that I normally would and stuff like that. And went down to 74. It was honestly just going to be one meet to see if I could get to 74 as just a intermediate goal, I guess. And then the meet went a little bit better than I was expecting, I guess. And then kind of stuck around 74 since then. I do have intentions to go back up to 3. I mean, in the sport of powerlifting, wants to lift heavy stuff, and it kind of sucks to be at that point of being, potentially, world record level in the bench anyways, and then kind of going back down and not being at that same level of strength, regardless of, where you are relatively. It's fun to lift heavy things. So I have some goals that I want to achieve at 74, and then I'll to 83 at some point.
So I do want to get into sort of, you touched on a lot of great things in terms of moving down a weight class and some of the considerations in doing so, and just sort of your expectations around what you can lift at that new body weight. I do want to get into that, but I just want to actually jump back and just bring Ryan in the conversation here, because your first meet, Ryan was there, and I just want to hear if Ryan remembers that, and then to give us your perspective, Ryan, in terms of when you saw this guy coming in the meet doing what he was doing.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about this morning. I was trying to figure out what year it was, if it was 2009 or 2010, because I knew we decided to try and get you to qualify for nationals. And I just looked back at the results, and here's some really good attempt selection. So you opened squat at 125, second attempt at 135, and third attempt at 170, which you missed. And then you missed your opener bench. I think you missed it on like the press command or something, if I remember correctly.
It was I missed it on some.
And you hit on your second, and then missed 142 on your third, and then opened deadlift at 140. 175 and then 200. So I mean, those pretty good ranges on those attempts there. But yeah, I think we convinced you just to do, because I think you might have been the only bench only person, and
most likely
you were a young guy, and we figured might as well 3 lift, right? There's no point just doing bench only if you can do all 3. And you came to Quebec that year for nationals, and I remember I think it was like Chris Arnold's squat suit or something you were wearing. So
yeah,
again, pretty baggy. So no, it was kind of one of those times when the sport was so small that someone new coming to a meet was, it was different, right? Usually you knew every person that came to a meet back then. So I remember Connor showing up, and we sat and chat with him for a few minutes trying to convince him to do it. And it wasn't too hard to convince him, because we just told him he could set the bench record if he did the 3 lift as well. So, and he could set the 3 lift bench record too. So it was a pretty easy convincing.
Yeah, 2 for 1.
The more records, the merrier.
That's right.
Yeah.
So Connor, like, there's a lot of people who who come into the sport as a junior, sub-junior, and then that's it. That's sort of their career, and that's fine. They move on to other goals, and they have success in other areas. But you've sort of stuck around, and you've competed as an open athlete, and has found success at both levels, as a junior and as an open. And I think that's quite rare, to be honest, like, especially as quick as it's happened for you, basically within a year and a half, you move out of junior and you're extremely competitive as an open athlete. I think it's natural starting point in terms of discussing that would be on the programming side, because that sort of is the thing that we do day to day. So I do want to talk about programming. Can you walk us through some of those early days and what you were doing? Ryan told us before the podcast, before we started recording, that early days you were sort of experimenting around with Chico, and perhaps that's how that's influenced sort of your programming style. So when you were sort of competing internationally as a junior, what sort of programming were you implementing, and just tell us a little bit more about that.
Actually, I think it might be better to even start beyond, or sort of before the kind of international beginnings, I guess. I kind of touched briefly on the bro days when I was playing football, and benching and arms and that whole thing. But then once I got into powerlifting officially, I naturally looked up how to train for powerlifting, and at that time the most accessible information as far as training was the West Side stuff, Louis Simmons and West Side, and that's you would Google how to squat or how to bench for powerlifting, and you'd come to a T Nation article that linked you to West Side or whatever. So I started doing conjugate initially, for I'll say 6 months or something like that. And it was a typical conjugate sort of setup, speed day for upper body, speed day for lower body, and then a max effort in each, now to rotate exercises, depending on what I, wanted to do and thought would work. I made good progress on it. Obviously, being a beginner, kind of anything is going to work to some degree, but it was really interesting because it gave me a lot of exposure to just different movements and kind of learning what worked and what didn't work. And the funny thing is, the reason why I got away from that wasn't necessarily the progress or the effectiveness of the training. The club that was here in Saskatoon only trained 3 days a week, and conjugate was 4 days a week. So it didn't, my training didn't line up with how they trained. They were at the time training basically, squat 1 day, bench 1 day, deadlift 1 day, accessories, whatever. So then looking into other methods of programming, just so I could train with the quote unquote team, I guess. And that kind of led me to the Pre-Lipin charts. And from there, I started building my own programming off of Pre-Lipin's recommendations that allowed me to still control my own training, my own movements, my own percentages and exertion and volume and stuff like that. But I could line it up then with what, everyone else was doing. So
let's just pause for I do want you to continue, but I just pause for a second and let's just clarify some definitions, because there may be some people listening who don't know what Pre-Lipin's chart is, and it's from a weightlifting model. Can you go into just what that is, just really briefly, and then you can sort of continue with your progression?
Yeah, for sure. So the way Pre-Lipin's chart works, like you said, is based off of weightlifting data, but basically it has given intensity ranges. I can't remember them specifically off the top of my head, but 55 to 65, 65 to 75, 70 to 80, 80 to 90, 95 plus sort of thing. And then for each of those intensity ranges, it gives a recommended optimal volume and then a range for number of total reps within that intensity range. So 85%, the chart might recommend a total number of reps between 10 and 20, with an optimal number of reps being 15, for example. And obviously that's might not be correct. That's kind of just, an example of what that might look like. So then I would take those parameters and build my program depending on higher intensity day, and then how much volume I wanted at a given intensity. And experimented with lots of different, makeups of how that program actually looked, ranging from lower volumes and higher volumes at different intensity ranges. But it was all based off of that chart. So that's what I did for probably almost a year. So the Classic Cup was my own programming, that nationals leading up to that was my own programming, all based off this chart. And then this kind of actually transitions nicely into some of the stuff you're wanting to talk about, transitioning from open to junior to open and stuff like that. After I competed in Sweden, I was making really good progress. I went up a weight class. The programming was proving really effective. My numbers were increasing all the way through the like every month, basically I was hitting PRs. And then I kind of got excited that I was making really good progress and tried to push that envelope more and more and more to make obviously faster progress. That's what everyone wants, is they want to get better faster and get competitive faster and hit records and all this stuff. And I think actually that kind of transition was almost like a 2-year period where I started trying other types of programming that pushed the envelope more than what Pre-Lipin's chart recommended, which is obviously based off of Olympic lifting. For the most part, everything's fast. You hit things easy and fast, and especially how I am as a lifter, fairly dynamic and hit things, with a lot of speed generally. So then I started experimenting with things like Smolov and Shaiko and different types of programming. And I basically tried, I think, everything, Texas method, 5-3-1, all sorts of different things. And it kind of almost stalled my long-term progress. And if I could go back, I wish that I could go back and just continue that progress week to week, cycle to cycle, block to block, and just let myself develop at the rate that my body wanted to develop at, rather than pushing things so extreme that you kind of almost get into that area of diminishing returns. Then you have nowhere to go from there, because you've accumulated so much volume and your body can handle so much volume you almost require that stimulus to make progress, and you have to kind of reset yourself almost. And that's what I did when I went back down to 74, is kind of start over. And it's hard being an athlete my whole life, playing, high level football and then coming into powerlifting. You want to be pushing that envelope. And I've always been, for like over 10 years now, I guess, in some aspect. And it's hard to convince yourself that less can be more sometimes when you want to be good and you want to be competitive and you want to be the best that you can be. So there's definitely a balance as far as metrics to dictate your training with, and to what level those are all at. So my training's definitely evolved based on all the different things that I've done. And I think it was valuable to do all those things, and it's given me a huge amount of knowledge. But I think if I was to do it over, I could be further ahead than where I am now if I could take what I know now and apply it all the way through my lifting career.
I love that take-home message. Just sort of like the slow incremental gains over time, just it keeps sort of chipping away at the total and not getting too greedy, but opting for more of a sustainable long-term approach. Just instead of, like you said, you get to this point where it's like, what do I do next? I'm already at this insane level of volume and handling it at quite high intensities. It's like, well, where do you go from that? Like you just can't sort of sustain that block after block. There's just nowhere to go. And sort of the analogy that I like to think of when it comes to programming, which just touches on sort of the experience that you have, is, when you're designing a program and you're designing the variables around it, you want to do sort of the minimum stimulus to sort of get you over the bar. If it's like a high jump competition, like just what are sort of the variables that get you over the bar, creates adaptation, moves the but not create variables that get you 10 feet above the bar, because you're going to make progress regardless. And if you're creating the program that has variables that get you 10 feet over the bar, it's harder to then move the bar up to that level and to continue training. So I think that's a very, very good take home point. I kind of see Ryan here shaking his head. What do you have to say, Ryan?
Shaking my head? No, I'm
like this.
Oh, nodding.
Nodding. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. No, it makes sense. Like, lots of people talk about how much they do in the gym and how hard they go and that's great. And I think it's perfect. And, but like you said, you get to a point where you have so much stimulus that you just can't possibly maintain it. That you can't, you're training for 20 hours a week, just trying to do all the volume. Right. And it works for some people, obviously, if you have the time to do it and you can keep pushing that envelope. But, for lots of people, just every set and every rep you do is a chance for injury. That's just my personal opinion. Everything I do is rolling a dice. So, if suddenly I have to do 10 sets of 5 just to get enough training stimulus, that's just, 5 more sets than I need to do, more risk.
And I think at that point, like for those people who you see training like that, I don't have any data to support this, but just, anecdotally looking at, people over the years, it's like those are the people that have a very hard time sort of translating their strength onto the competition platform. They have a really hard time sort of setting up a proper peak that's going to translate their strength on a single day. Steve, I know that you're sort of a guy who sort of adopts that sort of just patient approach to sort of programming. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I was going to say, so like when I, in 2015, like leading up to like nationals and worlds, like I remember just pushing my volume like crazy. I remember squatting, benching like 3-4 times a week and probably hitting close to like those like Smolov like weekly totals. And I remember getting through it, but it was just like, it was a grind. Like it was tough to keep that up. And yeah, definitely felt beat up. And now like leading up to meets in like 2016, 2017, I'm probably doing 60% of that. And I don't know if it's just me getting like technically better or, being able to recover better between workouts. And yeah, just like Connor was saying, like more is not always better, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think we're understanding sort of the training philosophy, Connor, that you've sort of had over the years and that progression. Let's talk a little bit more about specific programming. Like you obviously, I read a blog article recently that you put out on the Inner Strength website. Go check out the Inner Strength blogs. They have some fantastic content there. But you sort of laid out a structure of block periodization where you sort of set up, months or a series of weeks with a particular phase of training in mind as you prep for competition. Can you maybe sort of go over your approach and you can even use your just an example. You could take your training from nationals now up to worlds, because you are heading to Belarus on our national team. Maybe just maybe talk about block periodization in sort of how you're going to set up your training for worlds this year.
So something that I found really beneficial, I would say in the past year, kind of a similar time frame to Steve, is setting up my training in long blocks. So if my meet is in, or I guess end of June, but you take those 12 to 14 weeks and you lay out your training from now until then, and it keeps you on task, I guess, versus things like 5-3-1, where it's like, oh, that was really easy this week, I'm going to bump it up a little bit more next week, or I'm going to bump it up a little bit more than the week after. Looking at those long-term goals or intermediate, I guess, 12, 16 weeks sort of thing, but building my training backwards from those times, where I set myself to hit numbers that I want to hit at the time of the meet and work myself backwards from there. So right now, my average training volume, given a little bit injured before nationals, so my squat's not a good example, but lots of my training volume, average volumes are in like the 60% range. And it's easy to look at that and have it move really fast, really easy, and then want to add more weight, but then you start adding more weight now and you have nowhere to go, a month out from worlds. So generally what I'll do is set up blocks of training in the 16-week range, and they basically progress linearly across that block, with, again, I find Prelupin is a really valuable resource as far as understanding what optimal volumes are. And I kind of set myself the third week of the block to be what would be the optimal amount of training or of stimulus at that intensity. And then the fourth week being a little bit beyond what would be considered optimal. So kind of, pushing that envelope a little bit for a week. And the first 2 weeks are just getting you to that point of what's considered optimal. You push the envelope a little bit and then you start your block over and you build back up. So kind of this waving, like undulating, monthly undulating approach with linear progression across the block with an end goal in mind. So you're kind of, working your way up to that end goal of being worlds or whatever. And I find that weekly progress, whether it's, an extra 5 pounds, is motivating to know that I did a little bit more than last week, regardless of how that moved. It keeps you motivated to know that you're making progress regardless of how easy or whatever it is. And then it allows you to train in a way that builds you towards, your end goal. So rather than just building a small 4-6 week cycle with a test at the end of that 6 weeks, you're building for the 12, the 14 week, the 16 week period. And using that approach for newer lifters, the difference would be in those, transition weeks from one block to the next, you might maintain a little bit more intensity and work up to something closer to a 1 rep max, because you might potentially make progress in 4 weeks versus, I'm looking to add 2.5 kilos to 0.5 kilos at the end of a 12-week training block. So
yeah, so with that 12 weeks of training there, so it's like a big chunk of time to obviously do a lot of work. So like, for example, so you probably separate them in 3 4 week training blocks, right? So like, what would be the goal of the first 4 weeks, second 4 weeks, third 4 weeks, and then the final 4 there? So the first be it's like an intro, kind of more variation, second strength block.
In general, there's more variation at the start of the cycle, less variation at the end. What I've found over time, and maybe it has to do with, being more trained just in general, is it's beneficial for me to carry a little bit more of those secondary movements throughout the peak. Whereas before I would transition to 100% competition movements in my peaking cycle. And that's what would determine the peak, I guess, as you start dropping all this variation. It becomes very competition specific, fairly high intensities. And it's almost like that Smolov effect where you kind of beat yourself down and almost start going backwards. Whereas some of those movements, depending on the person, even just actively maintaining an appropriate range of motion that keeps you from getting injured in that peak and allows you to handle more intensity in the competition lift, which ultimately is going to, allow you to perform better. So every lifter is different, and every that I build for myself is different, because you have different, kind of micro goals, whether it's going to be a little more bench specific or a little more deadlift specific or a little more squat specific, and you add a little bit, or you change the secondary movements to kind of address those things. So sometimes things like my secondary squats, I'll use a movement that potentially would carry over better to my deadlift, kind of taking that conjugate approach from way back in my early days. So my squat volume is still squat volume, but the movement is there to potentially help bring along my deadlift more than my squat. So things like that, you start building the block around those different goals and selecting exercises based on those different goals. So I wouldn't say that each particular block is super specific to one particular goal, like strength or speed or hypertrophy. There's, I guess, a little bit of elements of all of those different components of training, and the percentage of each changes across that 12-week block. So your reps are naturally higher block, and your reps are naturally lower in the later blocks. So you kind of naturally transition from a hypertrophy kind of bodybuilding focus to a more strength focus in the end. But it's not to say that you're not handling, a potential strength stimulus in the first block. Just by the way it's set up, linearly progressing from the beginning to the end, you're gonna, transition from there.
I think that I think you're speaking to some of the complexities of programming, which is that, it's very hard to have things cut and dry and in nice little boxes. And you're sort of talking about these blurring of lines, right? Where it's not, this isn't a hypertrophy block. It's like, no, I'm going to have some strength elements here. And of course, there's going to be more of a ratio and bias towards strength elements leading to competition. But that's not to say that you're completely, doing the opposite 12 weeks away from a competition. And, it's hard to talk about periodization without talking about all the elements together. I think everybody wants to say, well, are you periodizing linearly? Are you periodizing undulating? What are you doing with your variations? Like, what is this specific phase of training? It's like, it's hard to break those down into like individual you can talk about them in individual concepts, but when you actually like put it into practice, it's a little bit more of a mix than anything else. And I think what you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that what is linearly progressing over the 12 weeks is the intensity, where you're sort of naturally building the intensities up over from week 1 to 12, but you're sort of taking each month and you're sort of building, each month up linearly before maybe taking, I don't think you use the word deload, but I'm assuming it's, something similar to a deload before you start your sort of second block, where again, you have those linearly increasing intensities and before taking another deload and then sort of peaking for competition. And then the way that you sort of structure your volumes around those increasing intensities is by using the boundaries of Per-Lipin's chart. Is that sort of how I'm understanding your approach?
Basically, yeah. And I'm actually glad you touched on this deload concept. It's something that I've been using, I would say, for almost 2 years, is defining the difference between a deload and a reload. And
actually, in the blog, you use the word reload in some of your descriptions. And then I was actually wondering about I wanted to ask you about that. So yeah, definitely go into that.
So whenever I type out reload to clients and stuff, I think they assume it's just autocorrect of the deload, but I do actually differentiate the two, and a true deload, or how I define a deload, I really honestly only take into a competition. So deload being a reduction in training volume and intensity to kind of get that super compensation or recovery or whatever going into a meet, but a reload, depending on the person and depending on the block and depending on how things are going, to reduce either the volume or the intensity. So it kind of strings those blocks together. So your average intensity from the last week of the previous block might be, but your volume might be cut significantly, so you're still maintaining some level of skill going into the next block. So lots of times people will come out of a deload and the first week is like super sluggish. They have all sorts of like DOMs and stuff like that, because you basically took a week of not training, I guess, when you've had 4 weeks of handling way more than what you would in that deload. Your body is trained to handle those workloads, and you only need to drop it enough to recover into the next block, not necessarily drop so much intensity that you're ready to hit a new PR at the end of that block. So how I'll do that, and again, it depends. Sometimes the people recover better from volume than intensity, and you might maintain one versus the other. But keeping top sets, if you're using the concept of a top set and a back off, keeping that top set progressing linearly from the previous block, but your volume from those top sets are backed way off. So you're still progressing in that same manner, but you're reducing total work over the week, which allows you to feel better going into the next block.
I don't think that this concept is talked about enough, to be honest. The idea of just transitioning your training blocks, because it is very important. And as you're saying, if not done effectively, like you could just be wasting time, because you haven't you haven't maintained your skill or your adaptations from the previous block. I think it is this concept that you're talking about is a very critical one to understand when setting up your training programs. And it sounds like, you use the idea of maintaining quite high intensities or similar intensities, or progressing them linearly from one block to the next during that transition period. And then the only thing that the variable that you're manipulating is sort of that volume. And it sounds like the frequency in which you do that is sort of every month. And again,
every month
probably changes. It probably changes for the type of person. Maybe it's every 6 weeks or whatever, but
depending on the lift too. For me personally, I've noticed a huge difference. My bench, I can handle longer training blocks, and it takes I guess it doesn't beat me up as bad versus my squat. 4 weeks of progression is almost pushing it. Like 3 weeks is kind of a sweet spot, whereas bench I can 6 weeks without having to drop the intensity or the volume. Sometimes I'll maintain the same volume, but the average intensity for that reload week will be way less. So you're still maintaining that level of work, but you're changing how hard it is, and either through the volume or through the intensity, and that's going to depend on the person. But yeah, the interesting thing is it goes so deep, as the individual lift can respond differently to periods of time and blocks of training. And your deadlift, you might want to maintain intensity through that block, and your bench you might need to maintain volume. Like it's dependent on the lift and the person and the period of time. And because powerlifting is a amateur sport, a hobby for most people, you have so many things outside of life or outside of powerlifting, real life that's going on that affects those things, and you can't control that. So there's so many variables that I don't think there's one clear cut way to go about doing anything. It's you take those blocks of training and those days of training, and you look at how it worked and how it's progressing, and if it's achieving what you're trying to get it to achieve, and then you adjust from there.
I want to ask Ryan, because he's nodding his head. I will just say that it's interesting to hear that you sort of come to this idea. I was talking to Kelly training. Spot training is that he's on a 7-week sort of build, and then after the 7th week, if he was to continue on to do an 8th week, that's sort of when he messes himself up and gets sore and pain, right? So he knows that it's like 7 weeks, then it's like time to transition. Ryan, I know you've sort of thinking about like is a chance possibly to get injured. Like, have you sort of come up with a formula for yourself in terms of like optimal amount of like ramp up weeks for each individual lift?
No, like, so my my injury risk is not for bench press. I find for bench press I have to keep myself at a lower relative intensity. I can't push the intensities as much. If I start pushing myself into the 82% range, it starts to beat up my shoulders too much. So I have to keep myself a little lower on that. And I think I do better in the 75% range and doing a little more volume there. For squat and deadlift, I find that, like Connor, I kind of like a 4-week kind of build up, then drop back, then build up, then drop back sort of thing. If you look at any of my older Stin system blocks that I have online, always the 3rd week is the highest intensity week, and then the 4th week kind of drops back off. So then if you ran multiple blocks in a row, you're going to be doing every 4th week will be your highest intensity. And I think it generally works well for people. It's obviously some people are different and they can run 6 or 7 weeks, like you said, without needing to kind of back off and recover. But generally, I think it's important to keep an eye on fatigue and soreness and even mentally, right? Like it's not even always physically, mentally, you can just be drained and dreading going into training. And sometimes it's good to push through that mental fatigue, but sometimes you have to back it off and just shorten up some workouts so you can kind of freshen up and kind of be kind of raring to go and ready to get into the gym and hit it hard again. It's hard to push through a hard set when you don't really want to be there anymore.
It's
very true.
Kind of interesting you brought that mental versus physical fatigue up, because personally I found that the mental fatigue is actually harder on my training than the physical. When I was going through university, I worked a labor job and would work over the summer anyways, long hours, you're shoveling, hauling cement or whatever, different things like that. And that was honestly probably my best period of training as far as, just consistency goes. You're always moving, you're sore, but it doesn't really affect your training once you're accustomed to the work that you're doing. But when now, and it's a super stressful day, or you're in meetings all day and you're doing lots of mental work, I find I come to training and I'm just like burnt. Like I have nothing left. Even though I didn't do anything all day, I just fried. And that's probably the hardest thing going from, I think, junior to open, is all the extra life stuff that you have to learn to manage. And it's something that people, I don't think, really get it until they get there, or they don't continue powerlifting. Like you said, you have these people that have their junior careers, and then you don't really see them again. And it's kind of a joke with some people about how through university it's always like, oh yeah, we're grinding away, and it's so hard to manage all this stuff. But when you're in university, you have your own, you make your own schedule, and there's obviously periods of time that are stressful, like exams and stuff like that, but really you have as much time as you want to train and as much time as you want to recover, for the exception of these maybe a group project or an exam or whatever. But once life starts and you have other things going on that you don't have the option around, then it more than just training and the physical part of it. And that's probably the biggest thing from junior to open, I think. I don't know if you feel the same, Steve.
Yeah, you pretty much nailed it, man. Because I remember being in school, and it's just like, all right, you go to your classes, you do your work, and it's like, yeah, go to the gym, and that's all you have. And I don't find that like that pressure of like doing your homework or projects isn't as like mentally fatiguing as now. Yeah, you're handling a lot more with like, yeah, your day job, and then afterwards or before in your training, but you're not in that same mental state, right? Because I think, I don't know, school's a lot, like being in school and stuff is a lot more relaxing, I would say, than obviously handling all that. With your job, like probably majority of people are working 40 hours a week, right? In school, you're not doing nearly that much work, let's be honest here. But yeah, I feel like you said, I feel the exact same way. And sometimes, yeah, training is hard, but then again, it's like your hobby, you enjoy it. So, we manage it and we get through it. And that's why I think we're at the level that we're at right now.
I think it's important. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say, like, as a knowledge worker, I hate that term, but as someone who, I sit at a desk all day at my job. Yeah. When
I've never even heard of that term before. A knowledge worker. That's cool, man. Business card.
As someone who sits at his desk all day, like, I don't have a physical laboring job most days. Like some days we do a bunch of physical stuff, but most days it's sitting at a desk, dealing with crap. And when you have a mentally tiring day, it's really hard to get to the gym and do it. And I have a lot of clients who apologize to me because they're like, oh man, I don't know why training went so bad today. Like I had a really, and then I dig in and it's like, oh, I had a really stressful day, or, someone in my family passed away. And I'm like, oh man, like mental stress is way worse than physical stress. So like, feel free to trail off or back off when you have that kind of stuff come up. It's important that you can't always push through.
Those are kind of all those things that I evaluate from one, cycle of training to the next. Was this too much for where I am in life right now? And I've been able to squat 4 or 5 times a week in the past, but I can't now, and it's making me go backwards because it's too much. So you're always evaluating those different things. And I'm kind of a regimented person, I guess. So I enjoy having my training to look to on certain days. Like, I get to squat on Mondays, and that's like, what I work on Mondays, knowing I get to go home and squat sort of thing. But at the same time, once things are happening in your life, you don't have an option but to, be flexible to move that to maybe Tuesday if something's going on Monday, and understanding that, things that's not going to change your end goal and your end, progress. But, in that moment, I'm kind of like, OCD about it a bit, and, upset I can't squat on Monday because it's Monday and that's the day I'm supposed to squat. But it's something I try and work on and look at the bigger picture. And, in the grand scheme of things, squatting Tuesday versus Monday this week isn't going to change anything.
Yeah, very similar in that sense. I mean, I remember, like last year before, I was training like 6 days a week, and the past, I'd say six months or so, been to like a 4-week training schedule. So I'll be training Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and I get everything in on those days, and this hasn't worked better. Like I feel I feel a lot more fresh going in on those days, not being in the gym all the time, because I mean, I work in a gym as well, and just being in that gym setting 6 days a week is sometimes drives me crazy. I'm like, oh, I'm in the gym for 8 hours, but then I have to go train for another couple hours. So I mean, in that sense, it can be pretty stressful. And then going off that point there that Connor was saying is like, yeah, trying to be as flexible as you can, because I have athletes as well, and sometimes like they'll contact you saying, oh, I couldn't get this training day in, like what do I do, am I screwed, right? And it's like, no, you're not. Like
you
right?
lost all your gains, man.
Yeah, you pretty much lost everything. You got to start from day one. No, but I mean,
deload to the bar.
Like, yeah, I mean, if stuff comes up and like you physically can't get to the gym, and it's like push that day or two. And I mean, so yeah, I mean, I've had clients in the past when we're literally going to be going into an intense phase, and they're like, these next 2 weeks I can't train. Like, am I going to lose everything? And it's like, well, if you have more important things, like your job is way more important than, getting an extra week of training in, right? So I mean, it's just, sometimes in life, it's just you have to do what you can and be flexible with training. And like you've built all those training days, so like from months and years, and it's like taking a week off or a couple like days it's not going to do much to your strength in the long term.
I think one way to look at it is if you only trained for 1 week for your entire life and you take 1 week off, you're probably going to lose a lot of your gains.
Exactly.
If you've trained for 5 years and you take 1 week off, well, you have 5 years of banked work. You're going to kind of sustain that, right? So people can't get so stressed over one day. One thing I've recently done is I've gone down to 4 days a week, major work, and then 2 days of accessory, which is kind of nice right now because I have a little more flexibility if I need to move days around. I think it's important if you need the flexibility, you can't train as many days a week, because you need to be able to shift things around. Whereas I've usually trained 6 days a week, and it's hard when something comes up. You can't really shift stuff around enough. So it's kind of important to have that flexibility built in.
I think one of the things that's just coming to mind. Sorry, one of the things that's coming to mind for me is like I follow Blaine Summer, and a lot of I'm sure a lot of people do. And right after Equip Worlds last year in November, he got quite injured, and while he was injured a little bit before that, his back and stuff, and he took like a full month off of any powerlifting movement. He just did tons of variations, and I don't mean like squat, bench, deadlift variations. I just mean like dumbbell movements and cable movements, and just got away from all the powerlifting movements. And he put up a post recently saying how he was really surprised, like he surprised himself that he was able to, within just 8 weeks of powerlifting specific training, he was able to do what he did at the Arnold's, which is like his best performance. And, it just speaks to the resiliency of the, if you're a trained individual and you have years of powerlifting training, just speaks to sort of the resiliency of your strength. It's not going to go anywhere overnight. If you can bench press 500 pounds one day, you're gonna be able to bench press from now with relatively little training if you have 10 years of that sort of build up to that. Just like Ryan said, you have to sort of look at the long-term spectrum. We've been talking now for about an hour now, and I just do want to sort of wrap things up here. I will tell a quick story. Connor, I've been struggling to find gyms down here, and I hooked up with a couple powerlifters who have some equipment in their garage. And last weekend I went there to train, and one of the powerlifters actually came across your, I don't know the name of your program that you have online, but what's it called again?
I'm not sure what's on there, to be honest with you.
Like you have sort of like Connor Lutz intermediate program or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's called the
so
Lutz program, LOOT.
Okay, so whatever, the Lutz program.
Like
so he's out there. Yeah, he's doing the Lutz program, and he actually. So it was funny because I'm in the random gym in like a random part of Chile, and here's this guy who knows who you are and has done your program, and he actually reached out and sent you an email about the program at one particular time, and you had got back to him, and it just in his mind he was just like, man, Connor's such a good guy, like. He's getting back to me with my questions, and he's so knowledgeable, and his program's awesome. So anyway, just a little bit of a story there for you. Do you want to talk about sort of that program and some of the other? I know you're doing some coaching a little bit, so do you just want to talk about that aspect?
I won't talk about the program specifically, but the idea, I guess, of those people reaching out is super cool and exciting, and kind of the flip side to what we were talking about before. Like I personally just love training, and the hardest part is balancing that love to train and being productive, I guess. Like Ryan was saying, he trains 6 days a week, and for me it would be hard to go down to 4 because I like to be in the gym and train and get better. It's exciting to see the sport growing to the point that it's a real, and it's something that is starting to get embraced everywhere around the whole world, and it's cool to be a part of that growth in the sport. And my dream, which will never happen, would be to be a full-time powerlifter, because I love doing that, and that would be unreal to do that and get paid to do it and be able to go to all these places and not have to worry about paying $3,000 to go to the World Championships and stuff like that. But unfortunately, that's not where it's at right now, and that's not where most sports are in Canada. So it's just that's a reality. But it's so cool to be able to have that outreach to places like Chile and just, I guess, be recognized for just doing something you honestly love doing.
Yeah, it's so cool. How can if anybody has any questions of what we've talked about today or anything like that, how can they reach out? I know that you're always happy to talk about training and stuff like that. How can people get in contact with you?
Probably, honestly, the easiest way that I correspond with most people is through Facebook Messenger, just because it's easy. But my email is klutz.training@gmail. So klutz.training@gmail. You can send me an email on there. Like I said, on Facebook. The Instagram Messenger kind of sucks. Avi can attest to that. His message was stuck in my requests or something. But I'm happy to talk about training all the time.
Cool, man. Well, we really appreciate having you on the podcast, and we'll be sure to touch base with you as you prep for the World Championships. And we'll all be watching to see what you do in Belarus. Good luck, and we'll talk to you soon, man.
Thanks, Connor.
Man. We'd like to thank Connor for coming on the podcast. If you guys want to keep in touch with Connor, he's given us his email, so you can shoot him a message at klutz.training@gmail.com. You could also follow him on Instagram at klutz.training. And that's a wrap for this episode.
Yeah, I really encourage you, go check this guy out on Instagram. Give him a follow because he's going to be prepping for the World Championships in Belarus and going to be looking to do some fantastic things there. Ryan, why are you so sad, buddy? You look sad right now.
I'm not sad, man. I just got something stuck in my throat. Try not to cough, that's all.
Podcasting quality, you got to keep the quality up. Keep your coughs to yourself, man.
That's the goal.
Well, that's another episode. And I guess what are we going to do now?
I don't know, one more episode this season. So
we got one more episode this season, and we've already been talking about bringing in a heavy hitter for our last season finale here. Somebody from the States, and we'll make the announcement on Facebook when we confirm this guest. So make sure to go follow us on Facebook at the Canadian Powerlifting Podcast. And that's about it. Ryan, Steve.
That's it, buddy. See you guys.
That's a wrap.
You know what they say in Chile?
What do they say?
Ciao. You've been listening to the Canadian Powerlifting Podcast, the podcast that brings you the best of powerlifting in Canada, hosted by Stephen Cassioli, Ryan Stinn, and myself, Abby Silverberg. Please follow us on Instagram and check out our website for some great free powerlifting content at www.canadianpowerliftingpodcast.com. If you like what you heard today, please rate our podcast on iTunes and don't forget to listen to every other Thursday for a brand new episode.